Senator Green, I know you've been a passionate advocate for a long time. Would you please talk a little bit about your resolution and maybe highlight some of the differences between the way Michigan balances its budget and our Constitution versus the way the federal government does theirs? Welcome again, gentlemen. Senator Green.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is surely an enlightening moment to see you sitting behind a microphone and running a committee, which I've never seen before.
Just make sure that you realize that I do have the gavel and can turn your microphone off at any time.
I do realize that, and you'll only get good, honest feedback from me today. We're not in caucus. Mr. Chairman and members, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and thank you again, Mr. Chair, for taking this resolution up. I sure appreciate it. Senate Joint Resolution 5 officially petitions Congress to call a federal constitutional convention for the purposes of proposing a balanced budget amendment to the United States Constitution. This is not just a simple little resolution to ask Congress to do something with nothing behind it. We literally can change our country today if we support this. The amendment would require that federal spending not exceed federal revenue, except during a declared national emergency. If our legislature passes this petition, we would join 19 other states with active resolutions on the subject. A total of 34 states are needed to force Congress to call a convention, and any amendment proposed by such a convention would still need to be ratified by 38 states before it could actually take effect. While representatives from the Federal Budget Amendment Task Force will address the technical details in a few minutes of the petition and convention process, I will talk to you today on why this amendment is desperately needed. In 2008, the national debt was under $10 trillion. In just a few short years, it's climbed to nearly $17 trillion. And in practical terms, every tax-paying age citizen is on the hook for about $150,000 of that debt, and add the interest to that every year and then see what you get. Even when applied population-wide, every man, woman, and child from newborn to senior citizen still owes $53,640. That means well over $1 million for my 20 grandchildren combined, a figure that makes their grandpa kind of nauseous. The skyrocketing national debt's a problem created by uncontrolled federal deficit spending year after year after year, and it will only get worse. And I don't have to even point to the federal government today on what's going on there, but it has got to stop somewhere, someday, somehow. It has got to stop. And this is the only answer that many of us see will ever stop this spending. In fact, it's estimated that the national debt will increase to at least $21 trillion by 2017, grow at a rate faster than our GDP. Just stop and think about these numbers just for a few minutes and wonder, really, when is it going to end? Will it ever end? And how will we end it? I mean, if you really think about what's going on, how will this end? And will anybody ever have to pay this back ever again? Like two freight trains headed towards each other on the same track. Uncontrolled spending and the national debt it creates will devastate our nation if we don't hit the brakes today. We'll need to look at Europe to understand that the resulting train wreck will be unprecedented financial and economic chaos, as you've seen over the last couple of years in Greece. The problem is historically a bipartisan one. I'm not here to beat up on the Democrats. I'm here to beat up on the Republicans as well, only the Democrats. I'm here to beat up on the Republicans as well, people in my caucus that have the same mentality of continuing to buy constituents year after year after year by their uncontrolled spending. Governor Snyder recently told Washington to stop the gridlock, pointing to Michigan as a perfect example of how to get the job done. And I agree. But as too often the case, our plea for sanity in the nation's capital has fallen on deaf ears. Frankly, I think we've given them enough time. Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution grants states the ability to provide leadership when required by proposing constitutional amendments. With the ongoing financial crisis and the political gridlock in Washington, D.C., there has not ever been a more appropriate time for us to pass this resolution than today. And the only permanent solution to the problem, regardless of who controls what branch of the federal government, is a balanced budget amendment proposed by the states. While Republicans and Democrats may not always agree on how much money to spend and where to spend it, they'll still have that problem. I hope we can all agree that government at all levels should balance its budget. And Michigan is also a perfect example of how a BBA would work. Our state budget is always balanced, regardless of the partisan makeup of the power, because our state constitution requires it. The provision serves Michigan taxpayers well and will serve our nation just as well by forcing Congress to apply to these basic principles. 3 of these: prioritize your needs, live within your means, balance your budget, plan ahead. That's what we do in Michigan. It's really that simple, and a simple common sense is what Washington politicians, Democrat and Republican, could use a lot more of right now. Senate Joint Resolution 5 gets us one step closer to a balanced budget amendment that will set the entire nation on a course towards fiscal stability, economic recovery, and a future we'll be proud to hand our next generation. I thank you very much for the time you've offered me this morning. I urge your support. But now I'd like to welcome Bill Fruth, co-founder of the National Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force and a well-respected economic development consultant that has some slides that's going to help you understand and get through this kind of seemingly complicated, but not really complicated, amendment to our Constitution. Bill?
Thank you, Senator Green. Welcome, Mr. Fruth. And you came from Palm City, Florida?
I did indeed. Actually, I'm from Ohio.
That's okay.
I moved to Florida back in 1984.
Very good. Well, welcome to the state of Michigan.
Thank
Hope you
you for
enjoy the
having me.
fall. Are you going to be here for a little while?
I will be here through tonight.
Let me just ask a question. Have you seen any of the Pure Michigan ads in Florida?
Yes, I have.
What do you think?
I think it's an appropriate thing for you to be doing.
Especially because we have a balanced budget and can afford it,
And
right?
you can afford it.
Yeah, okay.
I
very
assume
good.
that's coming from some type of a tourist tax fund, though, but maybe not.
Okay, you don't have to say quite as much as you just did. It's a
That's
general
true. I'm
fund-
starting to
it's
step
a-
into it. Maybe I shouldn't have said you should be doing it.
No, it's a general fund.
I enjoy the ads, by the way, when I see them, because I'm from the north, and we actually have family property still in Michigan. We come up and visit every year.
And we're pretty proud of the state that we have, and I've gotten really good feedback from other states, so I wanted to ask you about that. But thank you for being here, and I know you've got something important to talk to us about, so I'll let you get started with your presentation.
Well, basically, my business is economics. I analyze local and state economies all around the country, and back in 2002 became distressed, frankly, with the direction the federal government was heading with their deficits, and began to track it year after year after year, and became motivated to try to do something about it. I'm a volunteer with the Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force, which is a collection of individuals and organizations which advocate a balanced budget amendment convention. And I wanted to basically go through a process of explaining the need for this amendment, followed by explaining the process on how a convention actually works. In 2010, the state of Florida actually put on a general election ballot this straw question: should the United States Constitution be amended to require a balanced federal budget without raising taxes? Almost 5 million votes were cast. 72% of Floridians voted yes. That same year, the Florida legislature passed a resolution applying for a balanced budget amendment convention under Article 5. Our gross national debt will exceed $17 trillion as soon as they lift the debt ceiling, probably the day after. This is more money than the accumulated debt of all the European Union countries combined, and is greater than our gross national product. And that's important because this is the first time since World War II our debt has exceeded the size of our economy. And there are only 12 countries in the world that have a debt greater than the size of their economy, and not on this list is Zimbabwe. So we're in that group also. Deficits, of course, cause debt. And this graph shows us the deficit spending of the federal government since 1969. Going through here, these are all deficits all through this period of time. During this period of time, most of that deficit was financed by private sector investment and trust fund surpluses. We had a 2-year period when we actually cash flowed. Then when we had a Republican president with a Republican Congress, we began to have excessive debts and record deficits. A great deal of this was funded not only by federal trust funds, but by foreign investment. Brief 8 years from now, in 2020, our gross national debt should reach $25 trillion. Never before in history has this ever, the rate of deficit spending been, especially in the United States. This is our gross national debt, and basically what I'm leading up to is a problem we're presently facing beginning about 2 years ago that's going to carry with us for now until we have a balanced budget amendment. This shows the source of funding for our deficits. The green are our trust funds, Social Security and other trust funds at the federal level. This is private sector investment. We begin with blue, that is foreign investment. During the period of time from 2001 to 2012, 67% of the money to fund federal government deficits came from foreign sources, and almost half of that came from China and Japan alone. The other source of major funding for the deficits are trust funds. Now, you probably have trust funds in Michigan, but on the federal level, trust fund is a dedicated source of revenue, typically through a tax, and the money then for spending is legally limited to the purpose of that fund. There are roughly 100 trust funds on the federal level. When these trust funds have surpluses, they're supposed to be invested. You probably have, and I know in Ohio, our public employee pension fund is invested in private sector assets and it throws off a rate of return. Same thing with the trust funds, they're supposed to be invested, but the only place they have ever invested has been in Congress. The money is borrowed from the trust funds. During the period from roughly 1985 through 2013, these are the surpluses in the Social Security Trust Fund. Most of the years after they increased the tax rate here averaged more than $100 billion a year of surpluses. This money was all loaned to the federal government. There is no money available in the Social Security Trust Fund. Every trust fund has been looted. There is no money in the Civil Service Retirement Trust Fund. There is no money in the Military Pension Trust Fund. There is no money in the Medicare Trust Fund, which used to throw off surpluses, but began to run deficits about 4 years ago. All of this money must be repaid. There is no question about the obligation to do that, and repayment is going to become very soon. This year, a lot of folks talk about how that this is a problem in the future for our children or grandchildren. This is a real problem today for our nation. This debt and deficit is like an anchor holding down our national economy. Interest in 2013 was $420 billion, of which is equivalent to 34% of all the personal income tax collection during fiscal 2013. It was more money than the cost of 10 government departments at the federal level. Interest in the interest payment in 2007, when we had a $9 trillion deficit, was $429 billion. The interest payment this year on a $17 trillion debt was only $420 billion. So now we have to ask the question, what happened here? Why is interest payment so much less when the debt is almost twice as much? Enter the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. From 2008 to 2013, the Federal Reserve printed and loaned our federal government to finance its deficits $1.5 trillion. As of today, the Federal Reserve owns $2.2 trillion of our federal government's debt. In doing that, they purposely drove down the interest rate on our debt. They're basically loaning it. T-bills today are at 1/10 of 1% interest. The average interest on our debt in 2013 was 2.4%. You go back just to 2007, it was 4.8%. During the 1990s, it was 7%, a period when we attracted a great deal of private sector investment to finance the debt. And here is the problem. The interest today If the interest rate was the same as it was in 2007, it would have been $800 billion this year. If interest rates go back to what they were in 2007, within 3 years, interest on the national debt will be $1 trillion, which places the federal government in a real problem. Foreign entities are losing interest in financing our federal deficits. For an 18-month period, China and Japan flatlined and didn't buy much at all. Remember, during that period of time, I said they bought 67% of our debt. Well, frankly, they're losing interest in purchasing, and in about 5 years, they will begin to withdraw from our credit and sell their securities. Beginning about 2018, or probably 17, the Federal Social Security Fund won't throw off surpluses. They're used to taking $50 to $100 billion a year from surpluses from Social Security to finance the deficit. That money won't be there. Not only that, we have to begin paying $20 to $30 to $40 billion a year toward Social Security. That is a $150 billion swing from asset to debit in 1 year, beginning roughly 2018. Private sector won't invest because of the low interest rates. Federal Reserve Bank could very well become the principal source of funding for our federal deficits. This year, they will pay for roughly 65% of the deficit spending at the federal level. So what have we learned? Well, the gross national product is, gross national debt has increased since 1969. Congress plans to borrow $8 trillion more in the next 7 years. If we continue on this path, hyperinflation will incur. Massive tax increases will have to be levied, and we'll probably have an economic or political collapse. And many times when I speak at conventions around the country, I'm asked the question, when do you think it's going to end? And I never answer that question, because I'm afraid I don't want to be the one to cause the crash of the stock market. We are heading for some real problems, and something must be done about it. Well, what can we do? Well, you can do nothing. That's always a public policy decision. We can elect people to office who will stop spending and borrowing. Well, that hasn't worked in 30 years. We can riot in the streets like they have in Europe. Not a good idea. Or we can make it unlawful for Congress to borrow money and to propose and adopt a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. Well, you're all aware of the process, I believe. Article 5 of the Constitution provides 2 ways to propose amendments. One by Congress by 2/3 of the vote, and one by the states by way of a convention of the states. Either way is sufficient. I'm going to skip over that slide because Senator Green called this a constitutional convention. Oh, I didn't skip over it. Let's just go back a couple brief years because this is not a new issue. To have a balanced budget amendment convention began in the late 1970s and through the 1980s. Roughly 1992 and 1993, we had 32 states that approved applications for a balanced budget amendment convention. Then the effort stalled. And these are the states. You were not one of them at that time. The effort stalled for several different reasons. We had an election of conservatives in Congress who promised to propose a balanced budget amendment. It did indeed pass the House, but failed in the Senate by 1 vote in the late 1990s. But principally the reason why it stalled, because of a fear of what's called a runaway convention. Central government advocates out of Washington basically created a fear among conservatives that if we held this convention, that it would get away, run out of control, that the delegates could act on their own, they could just change the Constitution if they wanted to, and understanding that conservative states were needed to get 34 states, this fear scared off conservatives, and a great deal of that effort stalled because of this fear of a runaway convention. At the time, however, going back in the 70s and 80s, there was very little academic research that had been done on Article 5 of the Constitution. It seemed that every other article had been thoroughly researched by college professors and researchers for years, but Article 5 was principally ignored. However, as a result of being able to digitize documents, in the last 5 and 6 years, a great deal of the historical record during the time has now been investigated, digitized, indexed, and readily accessible to researchers. This information basically was not even available 30 years ago. And let me tell you what we have found. And we need to understand, I'm going to take you step by step through this process of an amendments convention, how it was conceived, how it's understood, and how their federal court rulings affect it today. We need to go back to the Annapolis Convention in 1786. Now, this was a convention of the states called for the purpose of interstate commerce. A convention of the states. Most people don't realize that at this point, this was roughly the 19th convention of the states held during the founding period of our country. State conventions, interstate conventions were commonplace. Between 1776 and the Philadelphia Convention, there were 10 interstate conventions. 9 called for one subject, to consider one subject. This convention was called for interstate commerce. James Madison was there, John Hancock was there, and they tried to deal with their subject, but their problem was frustration with the Articles of Confederation. But they knew this convention was called for interstate commerce, and they did not violate the subject of the call. What they did was recommend to the states that another convention be held to remedy defects in the federal government, basically to create a new government. So, the Philadelphia Convention of 1786 was established. At that time, most of us remember we had 13 states. That probably isn't taught in our high schools anymore, but that's how many we had. And they're all on equal footing. And so I list them up here. So after Annapolis, James Madison and others sat around and said, look, we need to put out a resolution for a general convention. And that's exactly what happened. The state of Virginia, followed quickly by the state of New Jersey, passed a resolution to call for a general convention for creating a new government. 5 other states immediately followed, bringing a total of 7 states that had agreed to attend a convention of the states to create a new government. Guess what? You folks are good politicians. In February of 1787, the Continental Congress, seeing their jobs being threatened, decided to pass a resolution recommending to the convention that they only consider amendments to the Articles of Confederation. They openly admitted they had no power over this convention of the states, and this was only a recommendation. As a result, 3 more states passed for a general convention in Massachusetts, and New York said, just amend the articles. Those were the instructions to the delegates. So now we have 10 states attending the convention in Philadelphia with full authorization to create a new government, 2 to only amend. What happened? Well, 2 of the 3 New York delegates went home because their instructions were only to amend articles. Hamilton stayed as an individual citizen, not representing the state. 1 Massachusetts delegate went home, and 3 stayed, and only 2 signed. Remember, they were only allowed for amendments to the articles. Of the 55 delegates attending this convention, only 2 disobeyed the instructions from their states. All others had instructions to completely create a new government. 3/4 of the states were necessary for ratification because the founders decided that would represent a majority of the population, and they also served under the tyranny of 1, which required a unanimous. They remembered their articles. In order to amend the articles, it had to be unanimous, that 1 state could do it, and they wanted to rid themselves of that concept forever. When George Washington gavelled the convention closed, nothing changed. This was simply a recommendation to the states that they form a new government. So what happened with Article 5? And this is probably one of the most important concepts of why we're here today. During the convention in Philadelphia, there was fear that the federal government would become too great. And so they understood that the Congress would never propose an amendment that restricted their power. And so they wanted to give the states equal ability to propose amendments. And that's how Article 5 is. They understood how interstate conventions functioned, and this is why they gave this power under Article 5 to the states. They apply for a convention. The convention is held to discuss an amendment. The states can propose and ratify, completely bypassing Congress. This is in the historical record and is backed up certainly by the comments made during the ratification process. So ratification wasn't easy. The states demanded the Bill of Rights. In 1788, this Virginia Commonwealth and New York called for an Article 5 convention that was open for any amendment. This is before the first Congress even convened. This is when James Madison said, I am against the Article 5 convention. I bring that up because a lot of people say that Madison was against Article 5. He was against this convention to be held within a year of the General Convention and before Congress ever assembled for the first time. The historical record shows very clearly that James Madison fully supported an Article 5 Convention of the States, in his words, for a single object, for a single subject. And he spoke on that in the Federalist Papers and through other documents. This is the convention he opposed. Well, what happened? Well, Congress met in 1789, passed the Bill of Rights, and everything went away. The Bill of Rights is what they were concerned about, which is why that application was made. So, has there ever been an example of, in recent times, so to speak, of a convention of the states? The most recent example was in 1861. The Washington Peace Conference is what it was called. President Lincoln had just been elected president, and the issue of slavery was like a powder keg in this nation. The country was more divided then than it certainly is today. The states, Virginia called a convention of the states for the purpose of discussing an amendment for slavery. They did not have the time to get 2/3 of the states necessary for a formal Article 5 convention. States were seceding, a lot was going on during this time, but they decided to have a convention of the states anyway. 21 of the 26 states sent delegations to this convention. President Buchanan and President-elect Lincoln attended. Former President Tyler was named chairman. Voting was by state, as the convention followed well-established rules for interstate conventions, and these rules are established. In fact, the best way, when we're going to have our convention for this amendment, simply go back to 1861 and look at the rules that they followed, because they were virtually the same rules followed for virtually every convention of the state that's ever been held. So, on Article 5, this is what principally are the steps. 34 states pass a resolution for the same subject. Congress is compelled to convene a convention and only set the time and place. And the reason why they are only able to do time and place is because this is not a legislative function of Congress. Congress is, in essence, an agent of the states. The reason why the framers have us sending these applications to Congress is because they needed a mailbox. There's a fiduciary relationship. And so Congress basically is compelled to call this convention, and their only duty is to set time and place. They do have the power to review the applications, however, to make sure there are 34 of the same subject. The legislatures determine how delegates will be chosen. They will provide you provide your delegates instructions and method for recall. The delegates are agents of the legislature. They are not independent contractors. They have fiduciary to you, because this is a convention of states. The convention creates its own rules, and voting is by state. Now, everything here is backed up by the historical record and federal case law. This is not the first time that Article 5 has risen out of the sand and has been attacked. There's a great deal of federal case law which affects this process. And just one quick example. The convention creates its own rules, and voting is by state. During the ratification of the Women's Suffrage Amendment, the state of Illinois had in its constitution that the legislature had to have a 3/5 vote to ratify a constitutional amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution says that the legislatures shall ratify amendments. The provision in the Illinois State Constitution was ruled invalid because the people cannot interfere in the process of this federal function. And the federal function was the legislature shall ratify. There are similar federal cases like this that control this convention. The appointment, as another example, the state of Montana back in 1978, the legislature refused to advance a balanced budget amendment application. The people of Montana had a referendum. and said, if you don't advance that application, you shall not be compensated as a legislator. Ruled invalid, because it is the role of the legislature to make the application. It is a federal function. And ladies and gentlemen, we today, this meeting is part of a federal function, because it's part of the application process for applying for a convention of the states. So real quickly, soon, people ask where the rules will come from. This activity is spreading, by the way, around the country. Last week I testified in Ohio on the same resolution. The Senate president there, actually, the House was dragging its feet, so the Senate president filed his own on Friday, and he has 17 sponsors, and that's enough for majority, so that one might pass quicker than the one in the House. December 7th, there's actually going to be a meeting of state legislators from around the nation called the Article 5 Caucus, who will begin the process of creating a committee of correspondence. It's their goal to have a convention of the states in May of 2013 to begin writing rules for a convention of the states. This process is growing, and we're encouraged by the interest of this state too. Prior to conventions, anticipated these delegates will solicit input from all around the state about the language for the amendment. Everyone in the world will know that this convention is called for one subject, a balanced budget amendment. And I can assure you neither liberals nor conservatives are going to want to step across that line at the convention. The conservatives fear that the liberals are going to propose some amendment to repeal the Second Amendment, and the liberals fear that the conservatives are going to propose an amendment to ban abortion, and who's going to cross that line? No one is. It would take a majority of the delegates from a majority of the states to violate this trust to make this convention do anything other than consider a balanced budget amendment. So, that's my presentation. I actually looked at the clock. I went a little longer than I thought I would, but you know, I traveled a long way to come here. I want to get my words worth here.
Don't get extra points for more words. No. But that was a very interesting explanation. I didn't understand a lot of the details, especially toward the end until now. It was very helpful.
Thank you.
Are there questions from any of the members? Oh, go ahead. He says he has a quick one.
Good.
Thank
I
you,
hope I have a quick answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How would you handicap the potential in the nation to get to 34 states in your work? I mean, you got a lot more.
We have a better
Experience.
chance today than ever in our history, and we had 32 at one point. The only reason this will not come to fruition at this point, we have 19 active applications. We have sponsors already filed or will be filed in 17 more states. We passed the Georgia Senate. We passed the South Carolina House. In the last session, this is going to be taken up in January. Our friends in Louisiana think it will pass quickly in Louisiana when they open up shop, I think in April. The balance of the states left then are conservative states. I don't have to get California or New York or some of the more, the states that feed off federal government money. The only issue is the runaway convention issue. The belief that this convention will run out of control is still pervasive. And if we overcome that issue, we could have 34, 35 states before the end of the next legislative session. If we can overcome, we have sponsors in every state. That is the only issue holding this up, and it's unfortunate. Because there's no, after you study the historical record and see what, even Patrick, they all refer to this Article 5. During the ratification process, during the writing of the Constitution, the ratifying conventions. How are we going to stop the federal government from growing? They all pointed to Article 5 and assumed the states would hold these conventions. Patrick Henry, Dickinson, Madison, Hancock, every one of them referred to Article 5. We don't have to worry. The states will have these conventions. And we've yet to have one. I get excited sometimes.
I noticed that. I would like to ask you just a brief comment, if you would, on have you looked at Michigan's performance in the last 3 years in balancing our budget and the time frame that we do that? Have you studied Michigan? Have you compared it to any other states?
Well, you get a very brief answer, and the answer is no. I have studied your economy, however, which is my business.
Yeah.
The bleeding has stopped, would be the best phrase I could give you. And that's significant.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're
It
right.
is significant.
Very good. Well, just so that you know, and if you get a chance to look in the future, we have been upgraded by a number of people, Standard & Poor's and Moody's and Fitch. We're now a AA bond rating instead of, I think, A- when we started, something like that. And the economic outlook went from 50th in the country to second. And a lot of that had to do with the work of this legislature and working with this governor and getting budgets passed 3 or 4 months in advance of the fiscal year. We put our rainy day fund, kind of like our savings account, from $10 million less than 3 years ago to $600 million. We're putting several $100 million also toward paying off some of our long-term debt while living within our means and balancing our budget through our revenue estimating conferences several times a year. So we think that something like this has helped turn the economy around in Michigan, balancing our budget and showing the people that have an understanding of financial issues that we're running the state properly. Do you believe that the global economy, the global competition, that United States versus everybody else, that the rest of the world would take a look at the United States and say, hey, that's really going to help to turn their economy around and make them more globally competitive?
From an economic point of view, this debt has hurt our economy and the deficits too. It's contrary to, deficit spending will help the economy. No. We borrowed $6 trillion, we printed $4 trillion, the GDP goes up $1 trillion. The math doesn't work on that. But it's also, and your point's well taken, if we ever reach the balanced budget and we stop borrowing money, then the federal government must do one thing to raise revenue: grow the private sector economy. And so certain government policies at the federal level, like you did Freedom to Work, there's a lot of things at the federal level that should be done that could stimulate private sector economic growth that will throw off a lot of cash to the federal government if they would do it, and they would get the money they want to spend.
And create those things called jobs?
Yes.
Okay, that's all I needed.
Okay.
All right, thank you very much
Thank
for
you for
taking the
inviting
time
me.
to be here.